The champagne flute trembled in Amelia's hand as she watched her ex-husband Gerald spin his new bride across the marble floor of the Metropolitan Club's grand ballroom. 3 months. It had taken him exactly 3 months after their divorce was finalized to marry the woman he'd sworn was just a business acquaintance. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across Vivienne's perfect features. The same features that had smiled at Amelia over lunch just 2 years ago, right before systematically destroying everything she'd built. The same red lips that had whispered poison into the right ears, turning Amelia's advertising clients against her one by one. The same emerald eyes that had watched with satisfaction as Amelia's world crumbled. "You came." The voice belonged to Jacob Blackwood, Gerald's former business partner, now standing close enough that she could smell his cologne. Something expensive and understated that made her pulse quicken despite herself. His dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her wonder how much he really knew about what had happened. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Amelia replied, her voice honeysweet as she raised her glass in a mock toast toward the happy couple. "After all, true love deserves to be celebrated, don't you think?" Jacob's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Is that what we're calling it?" The music swelled around them, a waltz that Gerald had once danced with her to at their own wedding. But tonight, watching him gaze adoringly at the woman who had orchestrated her downfall, Amelia felt something shift inside her chest. Not heartbreak, but something far more dangerous. Something that tasted like justice. She turned to face Jacob fully, noting how his perfectly tailored tuxedo couldn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders. "Tell me, Jacob," she said, stepping closer until she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "What do you think it takes to build the perfect life?" His gaze dropped to her lips for just a moment before meeting her eyes again. "I imagine it takes knowing exactly what someone else values most." Amelia's smile was razor sharp. "And what they'd do anything to protect." As if summoned by their conversation, Vivienne's laughter rang out across the ballroom, that same musical sound that had once charmed Amelia into trusting her with everything. Now it sounded like breaking glass. Jacob moved closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "What are you really doing here, Amelia?" She looked up at him through her lashes, her heart hammering against her ribs in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way he was looking at her, like he could see straight through to her soul and wasn't afraid of what he might find there. "I'm here to wish them well," she said softly. "After all, everyone deserves to get exactly what they deserve." But as Gerald's eyes found hers across the crowded ballroom, his face going pale with something that might have been guilt or fear, Amelia realized that her carefully laid plans might be more complicated than she'd anticipated. Because Jacob Blackwood was still watching her with those knowing eyes, and she had the distinct feeling that he might just be the one person who could either help her destroy Gerald and Vivienne's perfect new life, or destroy her in the process. The morning after the wedding, Amelia stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of her downtown loft, watching the city wake up below. 6 months ago, this had been Gerald's office building, before she'd quietly bought it through a shell company, evicting him in the process. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Her phone buzzed. A text from her assistant, * Jacob Blackwood called. "Wants to meet for lunch. Should I schedule? *. Amelia smiled, remembering the way he'd looked at her last night. Jacob had always been the more dangerous of Gerald's business partners, too intelligent, too observant, too willing to ask uncomfortable questions. It was probably why Gerald had forced him out of their hedge fund 2 years ago, right around the time Vivienne had started planting her poison seeds. She thought about Jacob's background, old Boston money, Harvard MBA, but with calloused hands that suggested he wasn't afraid of real work. Unlike Gerald, who'd inherited everything and squandered half of it trying to impress women like Vivienne. Jacob had built his own investment firm from nothing after the split, and by all accounts, it was thriving. What she didn't know was why he'd looked so grim when Gerald announced his engagement, or why he'd seemed almost protective of her last night. Schedule it, she texted back. Someway public. An hour later, she was researching Vivienne's background for the 100th time, but this time with fresh eyes. Vivienne Ashcroft had appeared in New York society 3 years ago, claiming to be an art consultant from London. But Amelia had learned to dig deeper than surface stories, especially after Vivienne had systematically destroyed her advertising agency by spreading rumors about financial impropriety and stolen client concepts. The irony was devastating. Vivienne had accused Amelia of the very sins she herself was committing. While Amelia was being investigated by the ethics board and losing clients to doubt, Vivienne was quietly stealing her strategic concepts and selling them to competing agencies. By the time Amelia had proof, Her reputation was in ruins and Gerald was already asking for a divorce. But now, with fresh eyes and 6 months of careful investigation behind her, Amelia had discovered something interesting. Vivienne's London credentials didn't quite check out. There were gaps in her employment history, inconsistencies in her education claims, and most intriguingly, a pattern of relationships with wealthy men that ended badly. Gerald had no idea he'd married a professional manipulator. Her doorbell rang, interrupting her research. Through the intercom, she heard a familiar voice. "It's Jacob. I brought coffee." Amelia buzzed him up, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected him to show up at her apartment, but somehow, she wasn't surprised. Jacob had never been one to follow conventional rules. When she opened the door, he stood there holding 2 steaming cups from her favorite coffee shop, looking rumpled and tired in a way that made her want to smooth the worry lines from his forehead. Instead, she stepped back to let him in. "You look like you didn't sleep," she observed. "Neither did you." His dark eyes took in her appearance, designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people's rent, but with shadows under her eyes that expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. "We need to talk." She accepted the coffee, noting how their fingers brushed as he handed it to her. Even that simple contact sent electricity up her arm. "About what?" "About the fact that Gerald's new wife isn't who she says she is. And about the fact that you're planning something that could destroy you in the process." Amelia's breath caught. So he did know. "I don't know what you mean." Jacob moved to her window, looking out at the building that had once housed Gerald's dreams. "You bought this place specifically to hurt him. You've been quietly acquiring his debts through third parties. You've also been documenting every inconsistency in Vivienne's background story." He turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "The question is, what are you planning to do with all of it?" For a moment, Amelia considered lying. But something in Jacob's eyes, not judgment, but understanding, made her realize that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry this alone. "I'm going to make them pay for what they did to me," she said quietly. "Both of them." Jacob nodded slowly, as if he'd expected nothing less. "And then what? After you've destroyed them, what happens to you?" The question hit her like a physical blow, because she realized she'd never thought that far ahead. Revenge had become her entire reason for existing, her motivation for getting up every morning. What would she have left when it was over? "I don't know," she whispered. And for the first time in 6 months, Amelia felt tears threaten to fall. Jacob set down his coffee cup and crossed the room to her in 3 strides. Without saying a word, he pulled her into his arms, and Amelia found herself melting against his chest despite every instinct telling her not to trust anyone, especially not someone from Gerald's world. "I've been watching Gerald and Vivienne for months," he murmured into her hair, "building a case against them both. But I was doing it alone, and I was doing it slowly. Too slowly." Amelia pulled back to look at him. "What kind of case?" "Gerald's been embezzling from the foundation he runs with Vivienne. She's been selling inside information to foreign investors. Together, they are defrauding their clients and donors out of millions." His jaw tightened. "But they are careful. Smart. Every piece of evidence I've gathered could be explained away by good lawyers." "So what are you saying?" Jacob's hands framed her face, his thumbs tracing along her cheekbones. "I'm saying that maybe we don't have to do this alone anymore. Maybe we can help each other." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Amelia could feel her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble under the weight of his steady gaze. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me? What's in it for you?" Something flickered in his dark eyes. "Pain, maybe, or regret. Because Gerald destroyed my father's company when I was 12 years old. He convinced my dad to invest everything in a real estate deal that Gerald knew was fraudulent. My family lost our home, our savings, everything. My father never recovered from the betrayal." Amelia's breath caught. "Jacob, I had no idea. Gerald doesn't remember. To him, my father was just another mark, another stepping stone to his success. But I remember. I've been waiting 15 years for the chance to make him pay for what he did to my family." The raw honesty in his voice made something deep inside Amelia's chest crack open. For months, she'd felt like she was the only person in the world who understood the particular kind of pain that came from being betrayed by someone you'd trusted completely. But Jacob did understand. He'd been carrying his own burden of revenge for far longer than she had. "So we're both damaged goods," she said with a bitter laugh. "Maybe. Or maybe we're exactly what each other needs." Jacob's voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. I have the financial expertise to trace their money trail. You have the social connections to get close to them. Together, we might actually be able to bring them down. Amelia looked into his eyes, seeing her own hunger for justice reflected back at her. But she also saw something else, a warmth that she'd forgotten existed in the world, a tenderness that made her want to believe that maybe revenge didn't have to be a solitary pursuit. "What are you proposing?" she asked. Jacob's smile was slow and dangerous. "I'm proposing that we give them exactly what they deserve. But we do it right. We do it clean. And we make sure they can never hurt anyone else again." Before she could second-guess herself, Amelia reached up and kissed him. It was supposed to be a kiss to seal their partnership, but the moment their lips touched, she knew it was so much more than that. Jacob kissed her back with a hunger that matched her own, his hands tangling in her hair as 6 months of loneliness and anger and desperate need all crashed together in one perfect, devastating moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Amelia realized that her carefully planned revenge had just become something else entirely. Something that felt suspiciously like hope. Over the next 3 weeks, Amelia and Jacob fell into a rhythm that was part business partnership, part dangerous game, and part something neither of them was ready to name. They met every morning in different coffee shops around the city, sharing information and planning their next moves. They attended the same social events, playing the roles of acquaintances while gathering intelligence on Gerald and Vivian's activities. And late at night, when the work was done and the masks could come off, they found themselves in each other's arms, finding comfort in the one person who understood the darkness that drove them both. "I never expected this," Amelia admitted one evening as they lay tangled together in her bed, city lights painting patterns on their skin through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Jacob traced lazy circles on her bare shoulder. "What? The sex or the feelings?" "Both." "Neither." She turned to face him, struck as always by how different he looked in these quiet moments, younger, more vulnerable, less like the calculating businessman and more like the boy who'd lost everything when he was 12. "I expected revenge to be lonelier." "It was lonely," he said quietly. "For 15 years, it was the loneliest thing in the world. And now?" Jacob's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers interlocking. "Now I'm not sure if I want revenge or if I just want a future where they can't hurt anyone else. Including us." It was a dangerous admission, and they both knew it. Because the more time they spent together, the more Amelia found herself thinking about what would happen after Gerald and Vivian were exposed. Would Jacob still want her when the common enemy that had brought them together was gone? Would she still recognize herself without the anger that had defined her for so long? But during the day, they were all business. Jacob had traced nearly $2 million in suspicious transactions from the foundation Gerald managed. Amelia had documented at least 6 instances where Vivian had used information from private social gatherings to make lucrative stock trades. Together, they were building an airtight case. The problem was getting close enough to gather the final pieces of evidence they needed. "We need access to Gerald's personal computer," Jacob said one morning over coffee. "The really damaging stuff won't be on the Foundation's servers. He's too smart for that. And Vivian keeps her real financial records in a safe in their bedroom," Amelia added. "She showed it to me once, back when we were friends. Said it was where she kept her insurance policies." They looked at each other across the small cafe table, both thinking the same thing. "The charity gala next weekend," Amelia said finally. "They are hosting it at their penthouse. 500 guests, open bar, everyone will be distracted. You'd have to go as a guest. Smile and make small talk with the woman who destroyed your life. I can handle Vivian." Amelia's voice was steady, but Jacob could see the tension in her shoulders. "The question is whether you can get past Gerald's security systems." Jacob's smile was sharp. "You let me worry about Gerald. Just promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that if this goes wrong, if we get caught or if it becomes too much, you'll walk away. Don't sacrifice yourself for revenge. It's not worth it." Amelia wanted to promise him that, wanted to give him the reassurance he was asking for. But as she looked into his concerned dark eyes, she realized that she wasn't sure she could walk away. Not from the revenge she'd been planning for months. And definitely not from him. "I promise," she lied and hated herself for it. Because the truth was that Jacob Blackwood had become the one person she couldn't bear to lose, which made him both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. The charity gala was everything Amelia had expected, opulent, excessive, and filled with people who had more money than they knew what to do with. She'd chosen her dress carefully, black silk that hugged her curves without being obvious, diamond earrings that Gerald had given her for their first anniversary, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Amelia. Vivian's voice cut through the crowd, bright and welcoming and utterly false. I'm so glad you could make it. You look absolutely stunning. Thank you. Amelia accepted the air kisses that Vivian offered, noting how the other woman's emerald eyes never stopped calculating, never stopped looking for weaknesses to exploit. Your home is beautiful. Gerald always did have exquisite taste. It was a perfectly delivered compliment that also managed to remind Vivian that Gerald had chosen Amelia first. A small victory, but Amelia took satisfaction in the brief flicker of annoyance that crossed Vivian's features. Yes, well, we've made some improvements since you last saw it, Vivian replied smoothly. The master suite has been completely renovated. Perhaps I could give you a tour later. I'd love that, Amelia lied. As Vivian moved on to greet other guests, Amelia spotted Jacob across the room. He was dressed as a member of the catering staff, invisible in the way that only service workers could be at events like this. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he gave her an almost imperceptible nod. Phase 1 was in motion. Amelia spent the next hour playing her role perfectly. She chatted with old friends, many of whom seemed surprised but pleased to see her looking so well after the divorce. She made polite conversation with strangers, donated generously to the foundation's cause, and even managed to share a laugh with Gerald when he approached her near the bar. You seem good, he said, and there was something almost wistful in his voice. Happy, even. I am, Amelia replied, surprised to find that it was true. Despite everything, the betrayal, the revenge plot, the dangerous game she was playing, she was happier than she'd been in years. Because of Jacob. Gerald followed her gaze across the room to where Jacob was refilling champagne glasses, his movements efficient and practiced. I heard Jacob started his own firm. Good for him. Is it? Amelia kept her voice carefully neutral. He always was too idealistic for the business world. Too moral. Gerald's tone was dismissive, but Amelia caught something else underneath it. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. Morals can be inconvenient, she agreed mildly. Gerald looked at her sharply, as if trying to determine whether she was being sarcastic. But before he could respond, Vivian appeared at his side, slipping her arm possessively through his. Darling, the Weatherbys are asking about the Foundation's expansion plans. Could you spare a few minutes? As Gerald allowed himself to be pulled away, Vivian looked back over her shoulder at Amelia. There was something triumphant in her expression, something that said I won and we both know it. But what Vivian didn't know was that while she was marking her territory, Jacob had slipped into Gerald's study and was currently copying files from his computer. What she also didn't know was that Amelia had spent the last 3 weeks learning everything there was to know about her husband's new wife, including the location of the safe where she kept her real secrets. An hour later, Amelia found herself in Gerald and Vivian's master bedroom, heart pounding as she worked the combination she'd memorized from watching Vivian's fingers at a party 6 months ago. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing exactly what she'd hoped to find. Financial records, copies of stock transactions, and most damning of all, a folder labeled insurance that contained photographs and documents that could destroy half the people at tonight's party. But as she photographed the contents with a small camera Jacob had given her, Amelia made a discovery that stopped her cold. There, at the bottom of the stack, was a file with her own name on it. Inside were copies of emails she'd never seen before. Emails between Vivian and several of Amelia's former clients, discussing strategy sessions and campaign concepts that Amelia had developed. But these weren't just records of industrial espionage. They were proof that Vivian had been planning to destroy Amelia's business from the very beginning, months before she'd even met Gerald. The betrayal ran deeper than Amelia had ever imagined. Vivian hadn't stolen her husband and then decided to destroy her life out of spite. She'd targeted Amelia specifically, deliberately, for reasons that went far beyond Gerald. At the bottom of the file was a newspaper clipping from 5 years ago. Local art dealer arrested for fraud. The photo showed a man Amelia didn't recognize, but the name in the caption made her blood run cold. Richard Ashcroft. Vivian's father. Amelia remembered now. Her agency had worked on the investigation that had exposed Richard Ashcroft's art fraud scheme. They'd created the campaign that had helped law enforcement identify victims and recover stolen artwork. It had been one of her proudest professional achievements. And Vivian had been planning her revenge ever since. Find what you were looking for. Amelia spun around to find Jacob standing in the bedroom doorway, no longer dressed as a member of the catering staff. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his hair immaculate, and there was something in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Something that looked almost like pity. "Jacob, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be getting evidence from Gerald's computer." "I already did that. 3 weeks ago, actually." He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Did you really think you were the only one planning revenge, Amelia?" The camera fell from Amelia's numb fingers as the pieces began to fall into place. "What are you saying?" Jacob's smile was sad and beautiful and terrible all at once. "I'm saying that Gerald destroyed my family when I was 12. But he also destroyed yours when you were 32. And I've been in love with you since the first time I saw you at one of his parties, 3 years before your divorce." Amelia felt the world tilting around her. "You, what?" "I've been watching you for years. Watching him take you for granted. Watching you pour yourself into a marriage with a man who didn't deserve you. And when Vivian started her campaign against you, when I realized what she was doing." Jacob shrugged, the gesture heartbreakingly casual. "I decided it was time to act." "Act how?" But even as she asked the question, Amelia was beginning to understand. "I'm the one who gave your divorce attorney the evidence of Gerald's affairs. I'm the one who made sure you got the building in the settlement. I'm the one who's been buying up his debts, creating the financial pressure that will eventually destroy him." Jacob's voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "I've been orchestrating this revenge plot for 2 years, Amelia. You were never the mastermind. You were always the prize." Amelia stared at Jacob, feeling like the ground had disappeared from beneath her feet. Everything she'd believed about the last few months, about her own agency, about their partnership, about the feelings growing between them, was crumbling in real time. "So none of this was real," she said quietly. "The coffee shop meetings, the late nights planning, She couldn't finish the sentence. The nights they'd spent together, the way he'd held her like she was precious, the way she'd started to believe that maybe she deserved to be loved again. "The feelings are real," Jacob said urgently, taking a step toward her. "Amelia, everything I feel for you is real. That was never part of the plan." "But I was part of the plan." She backed away from him, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. "I was just another piece you moved around your chessboard. Not just another piece. The most important piece." His dark eyes were pleading now, desperate. "I never meant for you to find out like this. I was going to tell you everything after Gerald and Vivian were destroyed. I was going to." "What? Ask me to marry you? Build a life with you on the foundation of lies and manipulation?" Amelia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Did you really think I could love someone who was just as calculating and dishonest as they are?" Jacob flinched as if she'd slapped him. "It's not the same thing. What I did to protect you. To give you justice. Justice I never asked for. Revenge you planned without my consent." Amelia felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You're just like Gerald. You decided what was best for me without ever actually asking what I wanted. That's not, isn't it?" She moved toward the bedroom door, desperate to get away from him before she completely fell apart. "You took away my agency, my choice, my right to decide my own fate. Just like he did." "Amelia, please." Jacob's voice broke on her name. "Let me explain. Let me tell you everything." But Amelia was already at the door. "There's nothing to explain. You're a liar, Jacob. Maybe you started with good intentions, but you lied to me every single day. About who you were, about why you were helping me, about what this meant to you." "I love you," he said desperately. "That's not a lie." Amelia paused with her hand on the doorknob, her heart breaking all over again. Because she could hear the truth in his voice, could see the genuine anguish in his eyes. But it didn't matter. Love built on deception was just another form of betrayal. "Love isn't enough," she said without turning around. "Trust is everything. And I can never trust you again." She left him standing there in Gerald and Vivian's bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes and his own lies. As she made her way through the party, accepting concerned looks and polite goodbyes, Amelia felt hollower than she had even in the depths of her divorce. Because losing Gerald had been painful, but losing Jacob, losing the future she'd started to imagine with him, was devastating. She made it to her car before the tears started. Sitting in the parking garage beneath Gerald and Vivian's building, she finally let herself cry for everything she'd lost: her marriage, her business, her faith in her own judgment, and now the one relationship that had made her believe in love again. Her phone buzzed with text after text from Jacob, but she didn't read them. Instead, She drove home through the empty city streets, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. It wasn't until she was back in her apartment, staring out at the building she'd bought to hurt Gerald, that Amelia realized the most devastating truth of all. Despite everything Jacob had done, despite the lies and the manipulation and the betrayal, she was still in love with him. And that made her hate herself almost as much as she hated him. For 3 days, Amelia didn't leave her apartment. She ignored phone calls from friends, declined invitations to social events, and ordered takeout instead of cooking. She told herself she was taking time to process what had happened, but really, she was hiding from a world that felt fundamentally changed. On the 4th day, her doorbell rang at 6 a.m. Through the intercom, she heard her assistant's voice. "Ms. Crawford? I'm sorry to bother you so early, but there's something you need to see." Amelia buzzed Sarah up, wondering what could be urgent enough to warrant a visit at dawn. When she opened the door, her assistant was holding a tablet and wearing an expression that Amelia couldn't quite read. "It's about Mr. Ashcroft and Ms. Vivian," Sarah said without preamble. "They've been arrested." Amelia felt her knees go weak. "What?" "Financial fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit securities fraud, the list goes on. It's all over the news." Sarah handed her the tablet. "But there's something else. Something about Mr. Blackwood." The tablet screen showed a news article with photos of Gerald and Vivian being led away in handcuffs. But it was the smaller headline below that made Amelia's breath catch. "Investment firm CEO turns over evidence in fraud case." Her hands shaking, Amelia read the article. Jacob had gone to the FBI 3 days ago, the day after the gala, and turned over everything he'd gathered on Gerald and Vivian's illegal activities. But more than that, he'd also confessed to his own role in manipulating their downfall, accepting full legal responsibility for any crimes he might have committed in the process. The article quoted him as saying, "I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment and compromise my ethics. I take full responsibility for my actions and will cooperate completely with any investigation." "There's more," Sarah said quietly. "He's holding a press conference this afternoon. I think he's going to tell the whole story, including your part in it." Amelia's blood ran cold. "My part? As far as the world knows, you were an innocent victim in all of this. If he tells the truth about your involvement in gathering evidence." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Amelia would be implicated in the same illegal activities that had brought down Gerald and Vivian. Her reputation, which was just starting to recover, would be destroyed again. But more than that, Jacob would be sacrificing himself to protect her. Even after she'd walked away from him, even after she'd told him she could never trust him again, he was still trying to shield her from the consequences of their actions. "When is the press conference?" Amelia asked. 2 o'clock. Amelia looked at the clock. It was 6:15 a.m. She had less than 8 hours to decide whether to let Jacob destroy himself to save her, or to stand beside him and face the consequences together. For the first time in 3 days, she thought about something other than her own heartbreak. She thought about the boy who'd lost everything when he was 12. She thought about the man who'd spent 15 years planning revenge, only to fall in love and have it change everything. She thought about the way he'd looked at her in Gerald's bedroom when he'd confessed the truth, not like a manipulator who'd been caught, but like a man who was terrified of losing the person he loved most. And she thought about the question he'd asked her 3 weeks ago. "After you've destroyed them, what happens to you?" Maybe the answer wasn't about what happened after revenge. Maybe it was about what happened when you chose love over revenge, truth over safety, partnership over self-preservation. Amelia handed the tablet back to Sarah. "Cancel my appointments for today. And call Jacob Blackwood's office. Tell them I need to see him before the press conference." "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked. Amelia thought about trust, about love, about the difference between being protected and being cherished. She thought about Jacob's hands in her hair and his voice whispering her name in the darkness. She thought about the future they could have if she was brave enough to reach for it. "No," she said. "But I'm going to do it anyway. Because sometimes the most important decisions were the ones you made with your heart instead of your head. Sometimes love wasn't about certainty. Sometimes it was about choosing to trust someone despite your fears, choosing to build something new instead of tearing everything down. Sometimes it was about believing that the person who'd made mistakes was also the person who'd learned from them." Jacob's office building was swarming with reporters by the time Amelia arrived at noon. She slipped in through the service entrance, using the access card Sarah had somehow obtained, and made her way to the executive floor. Jacob's assistant looked surprised to see her but waved her toward his office without asking questions. Amelia found Jacob standing at his window, looking out at the city below. He'd taken off his suit jacket, and his shirt was wrinkled in a way that suggested he'd been wearing it for days. When he heard her enter, he turned slowly, as if he couldn't quite believe she was really there. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "If anyone sees you, let them see me." Amelia closed the door behind her, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I read the news. I know what you're planning to do." Jacob's smile was tired and sad. "I'm planning to tell the truth. Finally. Even if it destroys you. Especially if it saves you." He moved toward her but stopped when he saw her step back. "Amelia, I know you can't forgive me. I know I lost your trust, maybe permanently. But I can't let you pay the price for my mistakes. And I can't let you sacrifice yourself for mine." Amelia took a shaky breath. "Because they were my mistakes too, Jacob. My choices. I was an active participant in everything we did. You didn't know. I didn't know the whole truth, but I knew we were walking in a gray area. I knew that some of what we were doing might not be strictly legal. And I chose to do it anyway because I wanted revenge more than I wanted to stay innocent." She met his eyes, seeing her own pain reflected back at her. "You took away my agency by lying to me, but I won't let you take it away again by protecting me from the consequences of my own actions." Jacob stared at her for a long moment. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that we face this together. We tell the truth together. Whatever happens, we deal with it as partners." "Amelia." His voice was rough with emotion. "You could lose everything. Again. I've already lost everything that mattered." She took a step toward him, then another, until they were close enough to touch. "I lost you. Everything else is just details." Jacob's eyes searched her face. "Does this mean you forgive me?" Amelia considered the question seriously. "I don't know yet. Trust takes time to rebuild. But I love you, Jacob. Despite everything, I love you. And I think that's enough to start with." Before he could respond, she kissed him. It was different from their other kisses, less desperate, less hungry, but somehow more intimate. It tasted like forgiveness and new beginnings and the possibility of a future built on honesty instead of secrets. When they broke apart, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure about this? Once we do this press conference together, there's no going back." "I'm sure." And surprisingly, she was. For the first time in months, Amelia felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Besides, I've always been better at facing things when I'm not alone." Jacob's laugh was shaky but genuine. "In that case, we should probably figure out what we're going to say. The reporters are expecting a scandal, and I'd hate to disappoint them." "Oh, we'll give them a scandal," Amelia said with a smile that was part mischief, part determination. "We'll give them the truth. All of it." An hour later, they stood together at a podium in the lobby of Jacob's building, facing a room full of cameras and reporters. Jacob spoke first, outlining his role in gathering evidence against Gerald and Vivienne, confessing to the illegal methods he'd used, and accepting full responsibility for his actions. Then Amelia stepped forward. "I want to clarify something," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos of flashbulbs and shouted questions. "Mr. Blackwood has been trying to protect me by taking sole responsibility for our actions. But the truth is that I was a willing participant in this investigation. I knew we were operating in legally questionable territory, and I chose to continue anyway." The room erupted with questions, but Amelia held up her hand for silence. "I also want to say this, Jacob Blackwood is the most ethical man I know. Yes, he made mistakes. Yes, he let his personal feelings influence his professional judgment. But everything he did because he couldn't stand to watch innocent people be victimized by criminals. That doesn't excuse our methods, but it does explain them." She looked at Jacob, seeing pride and love and gratitude in his eyes. "We're prepared to face whatever legal consequences may result from our actions. But we're not prepared to let Gerald Ashcroft and Vivienne Ashcroft escape justice for their crimes. Sometimes doing the right thing requires making difficult choices. We made ours." The press conference descended into chaos after that, but Amelia barely heard the shouted questions or saw the flashing cameras. All she could focus on was Jacob's hand in hers, steady and warm and real. Whatever came next, legal proceedings, public scrutiny, professional consequences, they would face it together. And that made all the difference in the world. 6 months later, Amelia sat in the outdoor cafe of a small town in Tuscany, watching Jacob negotiate with the local vintner in enthusiastic but terrible Italian. The morning sun was warm on her face, and for the first time in over a year, she felt completely at peace. The legal proceedings had been grueling but ultimately fair. Both she and Jacob had received significant fines and community service requirements, but no prison time. Gerald and Vivienne, on the other hand, were facing 10 to 15 years for their financial crimes. The foundation Gerald had run was being dissolved, with its remaining assets distributed to legitimate charities. More importantly, the investigation had uncovered evidence of several other victims of Vivienne's schemes, allowing law enforcement to build an even stronger case against both of them. Success, Jacob announced, returning to their table with a bottle of wine and a grin that made Amelia's heart skip. Apparently my Italian is charmingly terrible, which somehow translates to a discount. Your Italian is definitely terrible, Amelia agreed, accepting the glass he poured for her. But it's also charming, so I suppose he was accurate. Jacob had sold his investment firm 6 months ago, using the proceeds to pay his legal fees and establish a foundation that provided financial counseling to victims of investment fraud. Amelia had officially dissolved her advertising agency, though she'd been quietly helping several pro bono organizations with their marketing strategies. They were both starting over, professionally and personally. It wasn't easy, but it was honest in a way that their old lives had never been. Any regrets? Jacob asked, settling into his chair across from her. Amelia considered the question seriously. They'd talked about this before, about the price they'd paid for their choices, about the different paths they might have taken. About Gerald and Vivienne? No. They deserved everything they got. She sipped her wine, savoring the way the sun felt on her skin. About us? About the way we started? Sometimes. I wish we could have found each other without all the lies and manipulation. But we might not have found each other at all, Jacob pointed out. I was too much of a coward to approach you when you were married. And you were too loyal to Gerald to notice me even if I had. That's true. Amelia smiled, remembering the shy glances and brief conversations they'd shared at Gerald's parties, back when she'd been obliviously married to a man who didn't deserve her. Maybe we needed to be broken before we could be whole together. Jacob reached across the small table to take her hand. Are we whole? Together, I mean. It was a question they'd been dancing around for months. They were living together now, had been since the legal proceedings ended. But neither of them had talked about the future in concrete terms. Both of them were still learning how to trust again. Jacob learning to be honest about his feelings instead of trying to orchestrate outcomes. Amelia learning to believe that she was worth loving without having to be perfect. I think we're getting there, Amelia said honestly. Some days are better than others. Some days I still wake up angry about the lies. Some days you still try to protect me from problems instead of letting me help solve them. But I love the man you're becoming. I love the way you make terrible jokes when you're nervous. I love that you cry during commercials about rescue dogs. I love that you're brave enough to start over completely because you want to be worthy of the love you think you don't deserve. Jacob's eyes were suspiciously bright. You do realize I'm going to propose to you eventually, right? Probably in some ridiculously romantic way that you'll make fun of me for. Amelia laughed, the sound bright and free in the warm Italian air. I'm counting on it. But take your time. We've got nothing but time now. Jacob lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. What would you have done differently? If you could go back to that night at the wedding reception, knowing everything you know now. Amelia thought about it, picturing herself 6 months ago, angry, broken, consumed by thoughts of revenge. She thought about the woman who'd been so focused on making Gerald and Vivienne pay that she'd nearly missed the chance for real happiness. I would have asked you to dance, she said finally. Right there in the middle of Gerald's reception, in front of everyone. I would have asked you to dance with me and I would have told you that I was ready to stop looking backward and start looking forward. Even knowing it would have been scandalous. Especially knowing it would have been scandalous. Amelia grinned, feeling lighter than she had in years. I spent so much of my life trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect businesswoman, the perfect victim. But perfect is just another word for afraid. Jacob squeezed her hand. And now I'm not afraid anymore. Not of gossip, not of making mistakes, not of loving someone who might hurt me. Not of being hurt and choosing to love anyway. As if to prove her point, a group of tourists at the next table recognized them. She could see them whispering and pointing, probably remembering the news coverage from 6 months ago. The old Amelia would have been mortified, would have wanted to hide or leave immediately. But the new Amelia just smiled and waved at them, then turned back to Jacob with a shrug. See? Not afraid. Jacob's answering smile was radiant. In that case, Amelia Crawford, would you like to dance with me? Right here, right now, in front of all these people. There was no music playing, just the gentle sounds of the Italian countryside and the murmur of conversation from other cafe patrons. But Amelia stood up anyway, taking Jacob's outstretched hand. I thought you'd never ask. They swayed together between the tables, drawing amused and indulgent looks from the other cafe patrons. Jacob wasn't much of a dancer, and neither was she, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the way he looked at her, like she was the most precious thing in his world. What mattered was the way her heart felt full for the first time in longer than she could remember. I love you, Jacob murmured against her ear. Not because you're perfect, not because you need protecting, not because you're part of some grand plan. I love you because you're brave enough to start over. Because you're strong enough to forgive. Because you make terrible coffee and you sing off-key in the shower and you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen when you laugh. I love you too, Amelia whispered back. All of you. Even the parts that made terrible choices. Especially those parts, because they brought you to me. As they danced in the Tuscan sunshine, surrounded by strangers who didn't know their story and didn't need to, Amelia realized that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of hope. Not the erasure of the past, but the courage to build something new on its foundation. Gerald and Vivienne had taken 2 years of her life, but they'd also inadvertently given her Jacob. The revenge she'd planned so carefully had become something else entirely, not destruction, but transformation. Not an ending, but a beginning. And as Jacob spun her around under the Italian sky, both of them laughing like children, Amelia knew that sometimes the best revenge wasn't making your enemies pay. Sometimes it was living so fully, loving so completely, and becoming so genuinely happy that their betrayal became nothing more than the first chapter of a much better story. What would you have done in their place? Tell us your favorite love story in the comments. Hit the like button if you believe in second chances.